Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CALDERA workshop on automated adversary emulation. So over the past 2 days at Adversary Village and around DEF CON, you've most likely learned quite a bit about the value and the potential use cases for adversary emulation. But today's workshop is really a guide through one of the tools that MITRE has developed to enable automated adversary emulation, namely CALDERA. So in today's workshop, we're going to go through a little bit of background on CALDERA, its use cases, and then dive into installing it and running a very quick operation in the CALDERA environment to enable automated adversary emulation. So to provide quick motivation, you've probably seen a little bit of this before in some of the other presentations around the village and around DEF CON. But really, what we're focused on today is on offensive testing. Offensive testing is essential to getting those deeper insights into network security, the way in which your hosts and your networks behave when under threat, especially in the context of real-world adversaries and their tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. So traditional offensive testing is typically quite expensive, time-consuming, and often difficult to repeat. It does lead to incredibly valuable insights and really can help identify areas of weakness in a network or opportunities to further secure it. But it does come at a cost, as we've mentioned. And where automated adversary emulation comes in is really in changing the paradigm, kind of flipping it around, trying to make those same or quite similar insights developed inexpensively, quickly, and repeatably. And MITRE has developed a couple tools. You've probably seen the attack framework. CALDERA really builds off of the attack framework and enables a bunch of different use cases in a really cool way. So the real question we're going to start with today is how can we emulate an adversary? So we might know quite a bit about how adversaries and threat groups behave. We have an extensive knowledge base of some of those common TTPs that's based off of real-world cyber incidents. And using that knowledge base, what we really want to do is try to emulate some of those attacks that we see in real-world networks, in real-world situations that are most relevant to security operators today. And in order to do that, we need a robust framework for autonomously executing those operations and really leveraging those TTPs. And that's where MITRE CALDERA comes in. So at its core, as we've mentioned on the slide, CALDERA acts as a command and control server, a REST API, and a web-based GUI that enables you to automate some offensive cybersecurity operations, testing, and it builds off of MITRE ATT&CK, so it comes pre-built with all those common TTPs, really focused in on this sort of matrix-style framework, but in a really kind of novel and interesting way that leads to some pretty great results when you actually implement it. So CALDERA is mostly focused on post-breach simulation. It's mostly focused on those cases where you've already established a foothold or a toe in the door in a target network, and you really want to think through how you can exploit that. The steps you can take to conduct things like lateral movement, to identify information about network topology, maybe to find useful credentials, and then walk through credential dumping and really see how far you can compromise a network once you've established that initial foothold. And CALDERA enables this in two key ways. The first is that in its architecture, it's quite modular. So there's a core CALDERA service, core CALDERA server, that enables you to run operations and to execute some of those autonomous adversary emulation styles of simulation. But it also comes with a ton of different plugins that help you really elevate that workflow and the option to develop some for yourself. We have the source code available through caldera.mitre.org. We have a great community that's built around the framework, but also around identifying new opportunities to develop it, new use cases, and just constant improvements in functionality. So just to go through some of those key features that we mentioned earlier in the talk, we have really a main focus on the ease of getting to start using the tool. So it's quite easy to set up. The instructions, again, are on caldera.miter.org if you want to get a little bit of a head start in the workshop. And the focus on that setup is going to be an easy to use and easy to understand C2 server that, again, we can set up in minutes. And that focus, again, is on post-compromise testing. So once we have basically a foothold in a target network, what can we do with that? And the way that we establish that foothold is through agents. And those agents can be deployed on a variety of different operating systems, Windows, Mac OS, a bunch of different Linux distros. So really, it's quite an extensible framework for conducting some of these simulations and adversary emulation techniques. We offer repeatable testing. Now, that's one of the key features that Caldera offers. You can spin up an operation, conduct it against a specific host on a specific network, and really see repeatable results there in a way that's sometimes difficult to achieve with human-based defensive testing. We also have a bunch of cool features as far as logging and understanding the results of an operation. So rather than just trying to parse through the results yourself and think through what you learned and how you learned it, there's a great number of features that help visualize and communicate the results of an operation in a very user-friendly and digestible way. And that can be used both to inform future operations, but also to give some of those key insights that offensive testing offers on network security, network configuration, and network vulnerabilities. And finally, we have a bunch of cool features as far as stealth goes. So it's pretty easy to try and conduct a little bit of red team testing without too much of a reliance on maybe what is blue team or how do they respond. But we have built in quite a few different features that enable different forms of masking from the red perspective to try and get around some of those blue techniques to really conduct real-world simulations based off a lot of those TTPs again. At its core, that comes down to multiple obfuscation methods. And one of the really novel features that includes is that we're able to actually change obfuscation methods during runtime within our agents. And that really can do quite a bit to keep blue on the toes when looking through some of these automated adversary emulation techniques. Before we get into a deeper dive in installing and using Caldera, I wanted to take just a couple seconds to talk through some of those key pieces of terminology that you'll hear me use throughout the workshop. So first up, we have agents. Agents are the programs that we use to beacon back to our command and control server, that server being Caldera. These agents receive instructions from our server, they execute them on compromised hosts, and they enable really all the features that Caldera offers as far as adversary emulation. Agents, because we're focused again on that post-breach mindset, typically are established beforehand before running any operations. But we do have lateral movement features that enable agents to spawn more agents on other hosts in the network. Next up, we have abilities. Abilities are specific implementations of some of those TTPs that we want to execute on a target host. We have a huge database of these abilities that Caldera can leverage out of the box. So you, as the operator designing the adversary that you want to emulate, are able to choose from hundreds of different abilities when you're developing your personal curated adversaries. In addition to coming up with your own, we also have a great number of adversaries that work out of the box, pre-built within Caldera. And these adversaries are typically focused on common goals that we see in real-world threat groups. The core of these adversaries is typically quite succinct. We try to focus in on just those abilities that are necessary to achieve an end goal, But we do have some other more extensive libraries that come pre-packaged but not enabled by default in Caldera that we'll get to a little later on in the workshop. And finally, we have operations. So operations are another key piece of the Caldera framework and the way that one is able to work within Caldera. And operations really constitute a framework for the end-to-end planning, execution, and then modification of those adversaries and abilities that we talked through a little earlier on deployed agents. So once we have an agent deployed, or even a series of agents deployed across a number of hosts, we're able to run operations which execute commands using those agents in order to further the established goals as far as the adversary emulation goes through Caldera's C2 server. Before we start the installation process, I just wanted to go through one last description of the Caldera architecture and the structure. The focus here really is that Caldera is heavily customizable. As we've mentioned, it's open source, so you're able to go through, look through the source code yourself, find areas where maybe you think you could add a feature, change the way something works to better suit your needs. It's all there, free to access, free to use. And those open source plugins, we have a number of them listed in those light green boxes around the core functionality of Caldera in this slide. The modular plugin architecture means that we just start out with a number of plugins that help us hit the ground running as far as adversary emulation goes. But we have a number of other plugins that are not enabled by default, and even more plugins that you can pull from other GitHub repositories that really help elevate Caldera for more specific, more niche use cases. So we encourage you to go to caldera.miter.org to get a little bit of a better picture, read some of the documentation, and even check out our repository on GitHub. And with that, we're going to start the process of installing Caldera. And the installation process is pretty quick. I'm going to go into a virtual machine that's running Ubuntu and start the installation process myself. And I encourage anyone watching live or sometime in the future to follow along. It really is quite simple, and it all starts with caldera.miter.org. I'm going to pull that up real quick, and I will see you back in about a minute. Okay, so here we can see the MITRE Caldera homepage. There's a ton of great information on Caldera, some of its use cases, and the other features and functionality that we have built in. So the MITRE Caldera homepage gives a lot of great information on how it was developed, what the core functionality was at the time it was implemented, and how that has evolved. We can see the GitHub documentation and the Getting Started guide. We have quite extensive documentation on the docs. It's definitely always great to be able to reach back to that and look through anytime I have questions about using Caldera. So that's what we're going to do right now. And our Read the Docs page has a lot of great information, mostly a written guide on how to start running your first autonomous red teaming agents. There's a bunch of configuration details and things that you can get to know a little more deeply. But to start out, we're going to be installing Caldera. And we have the installation instructions listed here. It really is quite a simple installation process. You're going to need either a Linux or a Mac OS host to install the Caldera C2 server on. You can need Python 3.6 or above. And we really do recommend Golang. It's really leads to some interesting features in a lot of our agents and really takes them to the next level. Google Chrome is recommended. I've personally tested Firefox extensively, and I can confirm that it works quite well. The hardware requirements are also listed out here, but as I'm running it on a VM, you'll see that the Caldera C2 servers can even be run in more resource-constrained environments. The way that you start installing Caldera is just by cloning our repository. Right now, you're going to want to pull 3.1.0, but I encourage you to check out our caldera.miter.org page if you're watching this sometime in the future to make sure you're up to date with the most recent branch, most recent stable branch of Caldera. After pulling the repository, you're going to want to change directory to the new Caldera directory that you have wherever you're installing, and just run a quick pip install of our requirements. It's pared down quite a bit, so it really doesn't take too long to install those requirements. And finally, all you have to do is execute the server, and you'll be able to launch Caldera for yourself. I'm going to run through that process one more time in my VM. I'll see you back here in just under a minute. Okay, so we have our virtual machine up and running. This is just a pretty cookie cutter out of the box, just a demonstration of how we're going to install Caldera and then go through some of its use cases in the context that we've been discussing for automating adversary emulation. To start out, we're just going to we're probably just going to want to start with a new terminal. So I just was doing a little testing. We check, we can see we currently don't have Caldera installed on this machine. And all we're going to need to do to install it is run that git clone command. Again, we're pulling branch 3.1.0. And as we clone into Caldera, you'll notice that what we're doing is we're pulling both the core Caldera functionality in addition to all those plugins that are enabled or included in our distribution by default. Those are all sub-repositories. The source code is also available for all those open source plugins. And we also have a skeleton plugin where you can create your own. And it really is a nice functionality that enables whatever your specific use case is to be more effectively integrated into Caldera. In this case, I've already installed the requirements, but to show how that works, we can change directly to our new Caldera directory. We can run a pip install of, our requirements.txt file. So we just frozen the requirements. We have them all listed for the branch 3.1.0 or whatever the most recent stable branch is. And by running the pip install, we see that pretty limited number of dependencies, they're all installed as well. I'd encourage you to install Golang if you haven't already, because that's also a great little dependency, not a hard dependency, but one that does elevate some of the agent abilities to the next level. So now that we've installed Caldera from source code and installed the requirements, we can launch our server. And all we have to do there is run and here's one new feature for any of you Caldera users that have been around for a while. We now give a new automatically generated password. So we're going to want to capture this in order to actually log in to the C2 server. We have the red and blue options. We're going to be focused on red today. We're kind of simulating those post-breach activities in the context of automated adversary emulation. So we've just copied this red password. and we can see the rest of the process as it's running. You notice that, again, with that modular architecture, we see the plugins that we have enabled by default. That is by no means the list of all plugins that CALDERA has available. And once we get our all systems ready, we know that we're good to go back to Firefox, and we can just navigate to localhost, port 8888. That's by default what CALDERA C2 runs on. And we'll log in with our credentials that we saw in that terminal window, which is red, and whatever the UUID that you pulled for your terminal window is. I like saving it because I don't usually go back and change it. It's pretty long, hard to remember. So now we're in the CALDERA home screen. This is the first thing you'll see once you have CALDERA up and running. If you want to make sure everything's good to go, you can always check back in with your terminal. And you can look for any warnings here. In this case, we don't see any. We know we're doing great. So this is the CALDERA home screen. Most of the key features are going to be located under this navigate hamburger menu. I'm going to bring up this window on this left side here. And we can see we're really going to be focused on these three key plugins up here, these three key windows up here. As we mentioned in the slides, those are some of our key terms. We have agents, adversaries, and operations. To start out with, let's go to the agents tab. So agents are the way that CALDERA executes those autonomous operations, and they're also the way that CALDERA manages the beacons between the affected hosts, where we have a little bit of a foothold, and the C2 server itself. We can deploy a number of agents across a number of different hosts, but today, for demo purposes, we're just going to deploy an agent on the box that we have spun up here. And to go through that in a little more detail, on the left side of the panel here, we notice that we say explicitly we have to have at least one agent to run an operation. And that's because those agents are actually what's used to execute the commands that we have built into our abilities. And those abilities are what make up our adversaries. That terminology is going to make a lot more sense as we go through and execute an operation end to end. But to start out with, let's just go and look through some of these drop-down menus here first to get a little better idea of what exactly an agent is and how we can use it. So primarily, agents establish communication between our C2 server and any affected host. In this case, we can establish beacon timers to try and keep tabs on our connection to whatever affected hosts there are. This is especially important in a red versus blue type environment where you're at risk of having your agent removed by Bluetooth, but that's a little bit out of scope for the workshop today. We have a couple other features that are adjustable. You can set watchdog timers, untrusted timers, and change the implant name. By default, it's Splunk. I'm going to keep that. And then you can also add your own abilities. In here, we have a default bootstrap ability, but you can also include your own. And there's an area for you to add deadman abilities. And these ability IDs will be a little easier to understand as we get into them. But to start out, we're going to deploy an agent with these features and these settings that we've established here. And we're going to start with a SandCat agent. That's this 54NBC47, or SandCat for short. It's a Golang agent that communicates through HTTP. And it's a great all-around agent that CALDERA really is able to leverage quite well. We can install it across a number of different platforms, in this case, on an OS X host, on a Linux machine, or on a Windows machine. These offer a couple of different executors. In this case, Windows, you can run it for PowerShell or command prompt. We're going to be focused on Linux today. We're running an Ubuntu VM here. And we're just going to leave everything here default, but it's worth explaining these fields in a little more detail. So the contact HTTP is going to be the address and port of your C2 server. If you were trying to deploy this agent on a remote host, All you'd have to do is replace this address with the remote address of your C2 server, and then port 888 and whatever port you selected to run your C2 server through. And then the implant name, I'm going to leave it as Splunk. It's just the name of the executable that's used to compile the agent as it's deployed. So in this case, we can deploy our SandCat agent either as red or blue. We're going to choose red. And it gives us the command that needs to be executed in terminal pretty easy and conveniently here. We can just copy that, go over to terminal, open the new window, and run it. So just to go through again here what we're doing, we're setting the URL, or really the address for our C2 server, the port that we're running our C2 through, and then we're actually pulling the agent from our C2 server and running under a specific agent group red. So the TAC-V here just starts SandCat in verbose mode. We're able to see that we can communicate over HTTP. We have our beacon features enabled, and we see the server that we're communicating to, the group that we're assigned to, and then other features like the privilege. In this case, we're just a user, we're not necessarily a pseudo. We have some other peer-to-peer features that's explained in a little bit more detail in our docs and also later on lower in that screen. And you can see our beacon status as well. If we were to keep this terminal window up, we could watch the beacons happen as we'd set those parameters between 30 and 60 seconds. And we can also watch these fields here. In this case, these UUIDs that you see are actually links within CALDERA to specific abilities that are enumerated under our Adversaries tab. So let's go through and check those out now that we have an agent. We can see that we've deployed this agent on our workshop C2 host, the communication method that we have, in this case HTTP. We get a unique ID or a POD, in this case it's FBBEKZ. You can get pretty great ones sometimes you're less lucky, but it looks like we did pretty well. If we click on this green box here, we can see all those details as we established them when we created the agent. This is just a good way to keep tabs on everything, the method of communication that we're using, and the status of the agent, if it's been detected or killed on the blue side. So with the agent established in that box green, we can go over here and close out the agents tab. The next thing worth going through is adversaries. So as we explained a little bit previously, adversaries are collections of abilities, and those abilities are collections of specific commands that we want to execute in order to further some end goal, really. And these follow from the MITRE attack framework, so we're really leveraging those real-world TTPs, real-world threat groups, and real observations of actual cyber incidents. If I go keep this dial on view, we can look at some of the existing profiles that come out of the box in CALDERA. We're going to be focused mostly on Thief. Thief is a really cool, quick adversary that comes with a number of interesting abilities and typically leads to some pretty eye-opening results, especially when running this in real networks, just to try and see what happens. By clicking on Thief here, we can see the details, in this case the name, and then the description of our adversary. This is an adversary to steal sensitive files. Well, the Thief adversary itself is configured in such a way that it's typically quite harmless, and it doesn't make any real modifications to files. You can sort of picture in your mind the way in which, just with some slight alterations, you could find even more sensitive files or really do good network testing in that post-breach context and see maybe what CALDERA can find, what it can't, and how that can inform your network security decisions going forward. There's quite a bit visually here that's worth trying to understand in a little more detail. So just to start out, we see that we have a total of 5 abilities mapped to this Thief adversary. We can see the ability names in bold text at the top. And then brief description just below. We can also see visually what platforms these abilities work on. In this case, we're able to create a staging directory on a Mac OS host, on a Linux host, or on Windows through PowerShell or through command prompt. If we click on this specific ability, we get a new menu that opens up and gives us even more details. Namely, we can see the ability ID. This UUID is really tied internally to make sure Caldera knows exactly what to execute and when to execute it. And it enables consistency such that if we have multiple agents on multiple different kinds of hosts, say 2 Linux machines and a Windows box, we'd be able to execute the same ability on all 3 regardless of the system. And that's a great feature to have in some of those more network-focused contexts. We can see really the name, the description, quite a bit of information. And for anyone familiar with attack, we can see the technique ID, and that follows from the mapping that MITRE's established there. And there's a ton of different abilities, hundreds of different abilities that are built into Caldera out of the box, but you're also able to create your own. And that's a great feature that Caldera offers, really a way to, again, mold Caldera to your specific use cases and to get some great and interesting results as far as adversary emulation goes. Able to emulate more specific adversaries that really best fit your use cases. So with that, we have a little bit of a better idea of what abilities are and how they're structured, but we can also notice here that we have numbers on these abilities, and those numbers correspond to the order in which these abilities are executed. So just given a list of TTPs, it's sometimes difficult to know what structure and what order to use in executing them to get the desired results. In this case, if we tried to find files and stage them before creating a staging directory, it wouldn't work quite as well or quite in the way that we anticipated it to. Really, there is some semblance of order that we need to establish in our adversaries in order to make them effective and really simulate those real-world conditions, those real-world objectives, and even real-world results in some cases. So here, if we want to just walk through what the thief adversary is doing, it's creating a staging directory. It's trying to identify sensitive files, and then it's staging those sensitive files, moving them over to our directory, compressing our directory to a tarball, and then actually exfilling it to our C2 server. So this is a way that we can go through, if our agent's deployed on our remote host, identify files that might be of interest, copy them, send them back to our C2 server, and investigate them outside of the network that we've compromised. The thief adversary is also, as all adversaries are, customizable. So if you want to establish another ability, you can just click Add Ability, and a familiar system of TTP sort of structure comes up where, let's say you wanted to include, after you've done your thief adversary, maybe you want to run another discovery command. Under that discovery tactic, we can find specific techniques that are enumerated here. Maybe once we've found the relevant files, we've got everything exfilled, we just want to say, well, let's risk trying to find remote system discovery. We can find specific abilities that are under that tactic and technique and add them to our adversary if we so desire. In this case, we can just look through finding host names, and we can see the ability ID comes up, the name comes up, and some more details on what specifically is going to happen and how it will happen. Notably here, we can also add custom payloads. So we're not going to do that right now, but it is a feature that comes out of the box with Caldera. If there's a payload that you want to include in an ability, that's something that you can add and then have your agent actually execute your custom payload using Caldera's framework. So that is an overview of the thief adversary. And with that covered, we can now move on to actually running an operation. So this is the Operations tab that we came from this Navigate menu as well. If we want to view past operations, that's something we can do in this menu. But in this case, there's a fresh installation of Caldera. We're going to want to create a new operation. You just hit the View button, it turns into Add. And we can name our operation. In this case, we can just call it Workshop. We're going to be running the thief commentary here. And here is where we get into really some of the great features that Caldera offers, specifically for adversary emulation and specifically for automation. So we've seen a huge list of adversaries that come pre-built in Caldera. We'll go into a little more detail on some of the more real-world and threat group focused ones in a little bit. But for now, as far as automation goes, we can start off with the basic options for our operation. First, we can decide what agent group is used. In this case, we have one red agent, so we're going to select the red agent group. And as far as the adversary that we're going to try and run, we're just going to be running thief today. So we just walked through and saw those abilities that are included in the thief adversary. And that's what we're going to try and execute over the Sandcat agent that we have deployed on this machine. We have some options here, mostly for manual uses. You can keep these operations open forever until the user decides to terminate, or you can close it automatically. In this case, we're just going to close it automatically because we don't really want any user interaction. This is automated adversary emulation in the sense that the user can sort of fire and forget, say, we're going to start the operation, and everything will be executed and planned through Caldera without user intervention. In the same context, we're going to run it immediately. For specific manual use cases, it's sometimes nice to be able to pause it on the start, change the links around, change the ordering, maybe add new abilities. That's something that you can do while an operation is started before it is run. We're going to select Run Immediately. And then for our autonomous options, we have two different options here. Running autonomously does not require any user intervention, where manual approval allows the user, the person behind the C2 server, to either approve or deny each link and basically guide the operation from start to finish. We're going to be running it autonomously. And these other options here, there's a lot of great information in the Caldera documentation. We're going to be using the atomic planner. That was that ordering 1 through 5 that we saw in the thief adversary. And we're going to be using just the default parser basic facts. And we have some stealth options here. In this case, we're just going to be using plain text obfuscation, but just to show off the dropdown, there's a lot of different ways we can try and obfuscate our abilities and our agents' actual executions of commands. And this is the ones that are included out of the box, but you can imagine it's not too difficult to add your own. And with those covered, we can also see that we're able to schedule operations to run autonomously if we want to as well. That's not what we're going to be doing today. We're just going to look at our workshop thief operation and just double check to make sure that we've actually selected the thief adversary here. And with that, we can start our operation. We can see that our operation state changes to running. Right now, we've made one decision, which is that first ability that we saw in the thief adversary, creating a staging directory. And while it's running, I'm just going to explain in a little more detail what the UI is telling us and the way that Caldera conveys operations and the status of each executed ability. So to start out, we can see that we have our status bar here. We see that we're running. This could also say pause or finish, depending on the state of the operation and how many links that we have as well. This is just the time that we started the operation. And this here is the number of decisions or abilities where we decide to run or not to run that exist in our adversary as we have it in our operation context. We're able to manually pause, stop, and continue our operation, but right now we're in autonomous mode. And then we can see here the status symbols with within each of these specific abilities as they're executed. So right now, this guy is in gray, he is queued, and that all that means is basically we haven't started or finished executing it just yet. We're just going to wait a little bit, in this case about 30 seconds between our last find files command and start to stage our sensitive files that we found. We can see in green we have successes, and you see that we were able to successfully create a staging directory. We ran find files in a couple different ways, and that was successful. We don't have any failures or timeouts or discardeds or untrusteds. These you'll see more if you try to run with blue on the other end, or if you try to run a large number of agents across a large number of hosts. The links don't always work out, but you get really great use cases and quite easy operations across huge numbers of potential users. To go into a little more detail within each of these abilities that we've executed, we see not only the agent that executed it. We remember FVVEKZ from earlier. We deployed that on this Linux box. We can see what was executed. That's the create staging directory ability. And if we click this gold star, we can see basically the output of what happened and what we ran. So in this case, because we're running on a Linux machine, we ran make directory command. We created our staging directory, and we see that we were able to successfully do that. We get the staging directory path as an output there. And if we go through some of these find files, again, here we can see what we executed was just a quick find file command looking for PNGs. Right now, that's the way Caldera is set up by default. In this case, we found a lot of the static images that are used within our Caldera server. But that PNG could quite easily be changed to PEM or to whatever else suits your use case as far as basically evaluating your networks, seeing if there's any vulnerabilities or security considerations, and running some of that post-breach red teaming that we're able to offer through the adversary emulation framework and Caldera's specific focus on automating adversary emulation. If we check through some of these other find files abilities, in this case we're looking for YAMLs. We found some of the Docker compose YAML. We're actually able to Dockerize Caldera. Didn't mention it, that's a great feature. And some of the other Caldera configuration files, local and default, which we'll actually be going into in a little bit. And then the Caldera payloads and agents lists as well. And finally, going to the WAV files, we see that we just have the test files that are included by default in our VM. But this is just another case of us being able to identify potentially sensitive files by their extension and collect them into the staging directory that we built at the start of our operation. We see here that we're able to stage those sensitive files. And after staging the files that we found during our operation, we're going to compress them to a tarball. That's located here. And we're going to try and exfil that stage directory as well. So not only are we able to collect that sensitive information in one place on the compromised host, but we're actually able to bring it back over to the C2 server. That's a great feature, especially when we're running C2 server separated from the agents that were deployed, which is the typical Caldera use case. After running the exfil command, you'll notice that there's two more abilities that we didn't see when we looked at the adversary. And these are marked as cleanup commands. So not only do we want to be able to identify and exfil potentially sensitive files, we also want to try to cover our tracks as best as possible. In this case, that means getting rid of the staging directory and then the staged tarball itself as well. I mentioned earlier in the slide deck focus on logs and including useful information when executing these autonomous adversary emulation tests. We can look at some of that quickly here. In the operations menu, we'll notice 2 buttons. We can download a full report, we can download the event logs. We also have the ability to include agent output. So just to look at what that looks like, if we download the full report, you'll see a pretty extensive JSON document that covers exactly what was executed, when it was executed, and what the result was. And that's a great way to identify, again, some of those potential vulnerabilities that might exist in the network in that post-breach really scheme of maneuvers. There's a lot of great information on how the agent was configured. If you are identified by blue, you can try and drill down and see why or what command you ran in what context to get yourself identified. But that's just one of the many great CALDERA features there. It's worth talking through a little bit. So this was just a quick introduction to operations, to abilities, and to agents. But there's one more thing that's worth mentioning as far as CALDERA functionality goes in the context of automated adversary emulation, and that is actually our abilities list. So if we just quickly go back and look at those adversaries that we've seen here, those are built off of a huge number of abilities that are built into CALDERA. And you can see that there's a respectable number of adversaries that are included out of the box. We actually have more that you can enable by enabling a plugin to CALDERA that's included and downloaded by default, but not enabled by default. So to do that, we're just going to go back to our CALDERA server, and we're just going to start it quickly. So after stopping our server, we're going to go into our files. We see that this is where we downloaded CALDERA, so this is where we can configure it. If we go to the configuration directory and open up local YAML, we have a list of plugins that are enabled by default. One plugin that's included but not enabled by default is the emu plugin. This is really focused on emulation, and specifically on emulation of real-world threat groups. There's a lot more information on emu available in our docs. It was developed by the Center for Threat Control and Defense, and they really put a ton of work into making a fantastic framework for emulating real-world adversaries in a very realistic way, and giving anyone the tools to repeat those tests and those operations, given the right setup and right facts. So we're just going to save those changes that we made there. And this is a great trick as far as CALDERA goes. If we want to start our server again, we can just run python server.py. But because we made a change to our configuration, we're going to want to run it with the fresh flag. So a bunch of different flags. I usually run mine with log debug, just to get a bunch more in my terminal window and see specifically where I'm breaking things. But in this case, we're just making one quick change. We're going to run the fresh flag to reload our data and make sure that everything works correctly. And now we can begin track the plugins as they're loaded. In this case, we see that we're enabling stockpile, we're enabling response. Again, more information here available in the docs. Now we'll notice that we've also loaded plugin. And these messages here just indicate that there's issues in finding the abilities that are referenced by these specific UUIDs. We've included a lot of different potential tools that you can use when executing specific abilities in the EU plugin, and some of that comes out of the box and some is not. So just to go back, we now see that we have an all systems ready. We can head back into our web browser. We just refresh the page. Thankfully, we saved our password. We can just log in. And now when we go back to the adversaries tab, when we're viewing the adversaries, we see that we now have a bunch more new adversaries that are included in this dropdown. Ones that are included now that were not before include APT29, Carbonite, Fin 6, Fin 7, and then all the way down here at the bottom we have menu packs. If you want to check out menu packs and see what's included here, like before, we have the adversary name, and then we also have a description of what the threat group that menu pass is trying to emulate does, what their sort of typical TTPs are, what their goals are, potential motivations, and affiliations. And there's a lot more information there available through the Center for Threat Control and Defense online. But as before, we also have this atomic ordering of our abilities. So we can get an idea for how MenuPass operates and the style of adversary that they are based on some real-world cyber incidents. In this case, we can see that they try to bring in some of those ingress tools. They run some discovery techniques to try and get a better idea of network topology. They try to see how systems and networks are configured, look for firewall discovery, and then pretty quickly start to run credential dumping to try and elevate their privileges and collect sensitive data before exfilling it and covering up their tracks at the end. In this case, we see that this runs on Windows through PowerShell. So that's the agent configuration that you'll need to try and run a MenuPass style operation for yourself. There's also a specific list of facts, and those facts are basically details about your network, your host, and how they're configured, such as file paths, firewall settings, and IP addresses that are going to be required to effectively run a MenuPass adversary. That's just, again, scratching the surface of those more deep and detailed real-world adversaries that are available to emulate through the EMU plugin by the Center for Threat Informed Defense. So if you've been following along, you've now executed your first operation through CALDERA, or maybe one of many if you have more experience. And either way, I hope that you enjoyed that process. In about a minute, we're going to be wrapping up the workshop and walking through, again, some of those things that we were able to accomplish and the reasons that maybe it's valuable and the way adversary emulation can be applied to your workflow. Thank you.